Andrew Barry. I'm one of the teachers here at the School of Architecture and Planning, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth of the Fast Forward lecture series for the spring, for the autumn semester. Thank you for coming out. It's been a bit of a tough week, I think, for the Auckland architecture community, having farewelled David Mitchell yesterday, so thank you for coming when I'm sure everyone would rather be at home. We've got Tim Greer with us today, who's flown in this afternoon from Sydney, jetted across on a slightly late Air New Zealand flight. But Tim is, of course, one of our own. We still like to play him. He was born in Christchurch and then came here to study at the University of Auckland in the brick studio, as it was then. Although it was, of course, in the new building, and spent some time here, spent some time overseas, came back and studied and finished up in what, when I was a student a few years later, was referred to as one of the golden years of the architecture school. This is alongside people like Simon Toos and Craig Moller as they went through the school. Following that, he went to Sydney on what was originally supposed to be a kind of temporary jaunt. And like lots of folk, got stuck. And in 1988, he established Tonkin, Zulaikha, Greer, and has gone on to make that, be part of making that firm one of the leading makers of public buildings and public spaces in Australia. So we're very pleased to have him with us today to share some of his projects. One thing that just before we dive into the lecture is to say thank you to Winstone Wallboards, who are tremendous supporters of the school. Did you want to say a couple of words?
I'll just say very quick. Can't give an opportunity. So at GIM, we're just very, very excited. We've just celebrated 90 years of manufacturing in New Zealand, which is actually a pretty big feat for manufacturing in this small country. And we are just very honoured that we are able to continue our support of this. We've done this for a number of years and we plan to do it into the future, because it's great to get such terrific speakers to continue that design discussion and really, just keep those conversations going. So thank you for the opportunity, Andrew, and we look forward to hearing from Tim.
Okay. So if you'd join me in welcoming, hold on the plane from Sydney, Tim Greer.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. It's actually a thrill to be owned at long last. I know somebody owns me, but it's lovely to come to Straight Talk. It's so amazing to see a room full of, not everybody, but lots of faces that I recognise. So that is a real treat. Obviously, I just went for a walk around the architecture school, and it was quite wonderful, actually. And I just realised that the University of Auckland and the architecture school in particular sort of obviously has a very important place in my life or my heart, not only because I gained an incredible education, an education of enlightenment for me coming from Christchurch, but also it was the first time in my life I met a group of like-minded people who seemed to be on the same wavelength as me, and that was an incredibly important thing in my development. And I think also that when I think back of that education, possibly one person in particular who epitomises that more than anybody else, of course, is David Mitchell. So it's incredibly sad to hear about David. A couple of years ago, my wife Lindley Highmarsh and I had the opportunity to spend some time with David and Julie in Sydney. This is probably an unknown fact in Auckland, but Lindley whizzed David around in her convertible, and he rather enjoyed that and suggested they might do it again the next day, which they did. But it was so interesting to spend some time with somebody who was not only incredibly entertaining, but always trying to just stretch the envelope of the architectural discussion. And I think if there are two parts to an architect, this idea of enlightenment and entertainment, David had it in spades. So Andrew sort of asked me to talk about larger buildings and possibly urban design type projects today. And when Andrew asked for an outline back in January, I've sort of been thinking about how architecture is always spanning from one thing to another. And whether it's from ideas to reality, sort of lovely, vague, conceptual ideas being transformed into the kind of harsh materiality of reality, or even how ethereal cultural uses transform over time. And I'm not pushing the church here at all, but it's kind of fascinating to watch how Christianity started as a kind of an illicit activity that 2,000 years later became the centre point for most Western cities in terms of the cathedral dominating the centre of a city. So there's these kind of thoughts, and then just the sheer scale, how we continually work between small and large scale and large back to small. And then there's the notion of urban design, spanning from policy to place. And recently I had the good fortune to work very briefly with Rao Marotra, who's an incredible urban thinker. And Rao talks about urban design as the bridge between the abstract intentions of politics and planning and the site-specific pursuit of architecture. And actually puts it in a much more interesting way. But if we think about this in terms of Raoul's eyes, that we as architects can span between politics and place, and therefore time, scale and style, we can start to think of ourselves as conceptual bridge builders. And I thought maybe for tonight we could sort of just pretend that we are bridge builders, and we could even, I guess, even retitle ourselves if we wanted. And it kind of sounds rather good to me, actually. And I thought, I think to some extent, those of us who have been practicing, that's what we've almost been doing all of our working lives, but we've been making these very kind of complex, involved bridges. Now, I know Andrew mentioned urban design, but don't panic, there will be buildings, because I'm a practicing architect, firstly. So by way of giving my work some reference, I thought I might just sort of explain that the magic of architecture for me lies in my fascination with the world at large, and that is to do with, essentially, I'm fascinated by the interconnectedness of everything. So I favour, as I just mentioned, those kind of multi-limbed complex bridges, and hence the title of this talk, Mining the Continuum, Architecture Without Beginning or End. And we can think about this as a cultural continuum based on the notion that historic and contemporary cultures can be seen as interconnected with and there's a sort of a continuum that contemporary culture rests on, with contemporary culture merely the brightest light of the moment. And then the notion of the compilation of history, history is all around us, therefore it is in our present world. And we can also think about this at a physical level, and I'm really fascinated by I guess the notion of the greater system. And I don't see buildings as objects in their own right, because they can't escape being part of an urban setting, a landscape, a social network, or in fact a moment in time. And I view the city as an evolving organism, ever-changing, thriving and dying, receding, and most importantly for us, regenerating. And I find intriguing and a never-ending source of inspiration the inevitable discord of the city with its energetic dysrhythms and ad hoc collections. And I also like to think of buildings as miniature cities. So as we begin to look at some projects, this physical setting and moment in time is where much of our work occurs. And I love this grainy image, because it's kind of made up of towers, which we can see here, and then the sheds are down here, which are telling a story of the urban intensity of Sydney and its hidden geological secrets of rock and sand. I learned about the mysteries of Sydney's geology on one of the first jobs I worked on in Sydney from, of all people, a building manager, a guy called Len, who was well and truly in his 70s. The building we were working on had a substation next door, and if anybody stood still long enough, Len would tell them that we got the power first, and therefore we had first suck of the salve. So Len introduced me to the wonders of the rich Australian lexicon. So as we start to look at some projects, this is the Carriage Works at Everleigh in its original state. I thought it'd just be useful to show a diagram which attempts to explain as simply as possible what is this most inextricable act that many of us do kind of every day, the act of being an architect. And recently I had the opportunity to think about this process of making architecture and what it means to me. But like everything in the modern era, this slide comes with a disclaimer. I'm not advocating a method. This is purely an observation of my way of thinking. And for me, the kind of the 5 boxes along the bottom are almost summarises what architecture means to me, and that is that it is deeply connected to one's memory, and whether that's conscious or subconscious. There's a very deliberate process of looking, which is a period of searching what will we make our architecture out of. And there's this kind of notion of sketching, which could be a drawing, it could be a sentence, it kind of could be anything, but it's where the kind of, I guess, the personal moment in the process happens. It's a sort of a moment of invention by oneself. And of course, working on lots of large public buildings, as I've been doing, there's a lot of people involved, and it's kind of important that everybody gets, kind of has a moment to themselves within the project. Then there's this notion of adjusting, which for me is once there's this conceptual idea of evolving that and working with all the wonderful architects at TZG and our consultants and our contractors and so on. And then there's the notion of experience, which is that kind of, it is the moment of reality, it's the moment of reflection when we say, oh my God, what were we thinking? Each project I'll try and pull out a theme or two, things that I think are relevant. Some are just personal, and I apologise for those in advance. So the Carriage Works, for me, was very much about trying to find this bridge between a 19th century factory and a 21st century contemporary performing arts centre. And of course, they're totally incongruous. And it kind of started, this is sort of my moment of invention, where this idea sort of arrived where all of the performing arts venues could be containers. Those containers would be very plain, and we would restore the roof of the original building, and it would cast a shadow on the new building. So there's this ethereal relationship between the two genders, and of course we're using the exquisite sort of 1880s wrought and cast steel as a way of articulating our new, somewhat sort of financially threadbare work. Then the next move was working with our user group, which was a collection of incredibly interesting performance companies. They wanted what they talked about as the anti-theatre. And this we kind of converted into the notion of anti-hierarchical theatre. So we distributed the performance spaces across the industrial or factory grid as non-hierarchically and as simply as we could. So then there's a kind of another connection at this point. It's a physical connection because we're using the organisational system of the factory as in fact the organisational system for the Carriage Works. This sketch is just looking at the idea of scale, that all of the new elements we wanted to give the scale of carriages because this building had been filled with giant objects. And then we start to look here at a kind of a photograph of putting all this together and then transferring it into black and white so we can get a sense of the shadow and this relationship or this bridge between the two generations. And then lastly, my kind of favourite image where an artist has come and commented on all of this, that the reflection is in fact adding another story to this, these two generations of architecture. Of course, to make all of simplicity is deeply complicated in behind the scenes. The concrete structures inside the carriageworks are between 3 and 5 stories tall, with lots of acoustic and technical requirements, which were all done through this double wall system. And then something that we were very keen on pursuing in this building is this idea of non-specific public space. And we've always been very critical of the briefs we get for public buildings, which are like this, and you think, well, that will last 6 months. They're so specific. There's no resilience in the brief. The brief is designing an incredibly short life for a building. So we try and reduce a lot of the specificity out of briefs, and this space, which was loathed by Treasury because they thought it was useless, but it's actually just an interstitial space between two performance spaces, and it's one of the most used spaces in the carriageworks because it's very cheap to run. As we look at the entrance on the right and the I guess what was generically called the signage structure or the chorus line, this element came about because this carriageworks was to be the jewel in the crown of the Transport for New South Wales, which is Sydney Trains' master plan, but that master plan never eventuated. So the building was marooned, so we made this symbol at the entrance. We've taken a series of trusses, we've anthropomorphised them, stood them on their end, and turned them into a chorus line, if you like, to signify the new use. But what has happened in the 10 years since the carriageworks has opened is it's gone from 80,000 users to 880,000 users. So this cultural pursuit has given the area a cultural cachet, and now the carriageworks find themselves in a terrible situation where commercial entities are trying to take over the land all around it, and in particular this space over here, which we can kind of see here. So we're down here because that's this area here. So we get large multinational organisations like Google coming to Sydney and say, we'll have that. The carriageworks, who created the cultural capital of the area in the first place, are now sort of being seen in the evolution of the city, that they've done their job and they can kind of move on to somewhere else. So the carriageworks is run by a truly inspiring director, and she is now kind of pushing back. So we're doing a master plan for 2020, which is claiming that commercial space, and then we are proposing to build our own commercial building, which is truly vast, on top of all of this extended cultural use. So it's a kind of a really interesting dynamic that the cultural capital always leads the financial capital in a city. This project, Paddington Reservoir Gardens, occupies this really interesting place in Sydney. It's kind of on what I always refer to as Len's Ridge, because he was the person that told me about this. Everything to the north or up the screen is rock, everything to the south is sand. It was a very strange building in that it had been a water reservoir in the 1860s and 1870s. It was a monumental failure. It had stopped being used by the 1890s and had fallen into disrepair. So this was kind of what we found. And what I love about this image is just the sheer chaos of it. You look at it, I know it's 4 images, but when we went there, we couldn't really understand anything. But now when you see the building, everything seems so clear. This is this process of kind of looking. It takes a long time to work out what it is that we have inherited. Incredibly beautiful sort of mid-19th century engineering architecture. And for me, this project, or I guess the sketch at this stage, really relied around this very simple kind of observation or objective that the concept for the new use could in fact lurk within the artefact. We had inherited a ruin which was very fragile, and how would we maintain that fragility but then bring a kind of a new use to it? So firstly, we proposed that the reservoir would stay as a series of rooms, not to be capped like that 1950s photo, and that was the brief that the City of Sydney came to us. So then this idea of of extracting the concept out of the artefact. So some sort of finite examples of that are that the original building was built out of 3 materials: brick, timber, and wrought and cast iron. So we said that our new building would be made out of 3 materials. The existing building is a cellular modular building made out of bricks and posts, etc., and jointing bits. So where we had new surfaces, we made them out of precast concrete. So it was a unitary system. And then we can kind of see in this canopy that the sun shading is actually made out of the mortar joints of the brickwork. So it has the same scale and it has a kind of a connection to the original building. So a completely different time, different material, but there's this kind of conversation going on. The other thing that a ruin allows us to do is that, because it's a collection of remnant structure, and it's absolutely fascinating because we only see bits of the overall whole and our mind makes up the rest. So it probably is more interesting than it really is, but because we had these bits, we used a very fragmentary kind of planning method to connect all these pieces together that, again, wouldn't be possible with a new building from scratch. One of the other, I guess, benefits that came out of this kind of sentence was that Anton James, the landscape architect, said, well, if that's the case, why don't we use planting that was popular in the 1860s and 1870s in Sydney, so that there was a kind of a richness. So that was his take on this comment that the concept lurked within the artefact. And the electrical engineers got in on the swing of things, and they said, well, if you put red and blue light together, it oscillates. So the frequency slightly upsets the eye, and you have a sense of oscillation like water. And this space would have originally been full of water. The building itself is on Oxford Street, which of course is where the Mardi Gras comes. And I was explaining this to some people one day, and they thought this was just about Mardi Gras. They didn't realise it was an architectural intent or a lighting intent. So here we get a sense of the kind of planning. It's very fractured in the section, and again the detailing was deliberately very much underplayed because we wanted to see the ruin, and we had this kind of slight problem as we were documenting the building because documenting the new work because the old building kept collapsing, and in fact this middle condition here, which is an all concrete fan rib. We didn't have that at the beginning of the documentation because we didn't need it, but by the time we got to the end of the documentation, we did need it because that piece of the reservoir had collapsed. The thing I've always found fascinating about this building is that it's only here through political vision. The idea of putting public space under street level or below street level gave everybody in the City Council an absolute nightmare, and they didn't want it to happen. We were given one shot to explain this to the mayor. She got it instantly and actually brokered the deal with the management company because the council's management arm, because the main park down the road is open and closed sunrise, sunset each day, and she just said, well, that bloke can come down and do this one as well. So it was very kind of a simple fix to what had been a major problem. So at this point, the point I'm making is that public architecture relies very heavily on good governance and political foresight. So this idea of the fragment, the ruin, collecting together the gates and the balustrades and the signage, so again, not to overpower the building, but developing it in a way that's using a sort of set of principles based around remnant buildings. And these brise-de-layer canopies, they're doing a couple of things. They're screening the space from the sun, but also they become a signifier that by looking up you can see that there is a space below. So we've moved back to New Zealand here, and this was a kind of a project for when LVMH bought the ultimate luxury brand bought Cloudy Bay. they wanted, I guess, to make a statement on their vineyard, which is probably the queen of their portfolio of vineyards. And they asked us to engage with this label. They knew that this label was absolute gold in marketing terms, and here's this kind of very picturesque view of the Richmond Ranges. And I thought this project was a great opportunity for me to, I guess, to come to terms in some way with my thoughts about the New Zealand landscape, which I must say have always been fraught. And this painting by Colin McCann, 6 days in Nelson and Canterbury, always seemed to sum it up, this kind of insolent absence in the landscape where sky and hills are so tightly bound together there's no room for human habitation. And so this idea of trying to find a bridge between the experience or more to the point, the representation of the label that people would see and the actual bottle. And how Cloudy Bay used this building, it's to bring people out from Europe for an experience, so when they go back to Europe they would never forget their time at Cloudy Bay. And so this was the kind of beginning of it, this incredibly simple section that looks out along the vineyards to the Richmond Ranges, and the building was shaped in such a way that you enter at this end around here, and as you walk along here the building opens out down the vineyards to the Richmond Ranges. And it created this kind of shape. This is a very long, essentially entertaining room downstairs and 3 bedrooms upstairs, all put together, sort of immaculately detailed, using this very simple material of plywood. Sorry, Nicole, it's not gyp, but next time. So this is kind of how we made this building, and it came about because of this fire. And I only found this photo a few weeks ago, and I'm thinking, you know, there was this great tragedy that they lost the shack. This was the original building of Cloudy Bay, but they had this kind of perfect photo of it burning down. And the Cloudy Bay myth was that, myth it's probably true, that a French sommelier came out from France, pulled the sofa out onto the veranda with one of their finest bottles or something and fell asleep. So, that was very bad, we had to build a new building. So that's how we had this kind of wonderful opportunity to make this building. And of course I just love this photo because this is what it's all about, creating these places for extraordinary experiences to happen. This is their 30th birthday. And I learned a lot of things on this job, but 3 in particular. Firstly, taking time to think about the sheer beauty of the New Zealand landscape and this kind of insolence and absence that it also has, and really thinking, well, that's more my problem than the landscape's problem. And then also we had a partner architect in Paul Rolfe from Wellington who we partnered for this project, and he did the most extraordinary job of some of the most beautiful detailing on this building. And thirdly, when they had the opening party, the red wine sommelier took me aside and he started pointing and prodding me in the chest in kind of quite a sort of drunken manner, and he said he knew what I'd been up to, and I was a little embarrassed at this moment. And then he said no, he was talking about the front door, and what he said is that you have evaginated the front door. So I didn't know actually that this word existed, so I quietly went off to the loo and looked it up, and it does exist. It means to fold in on oneself. So there's this, we can learn things as we go through our life as architects. So this kind of setting that we're seeing here is Port Macquarie. It's about 400 kilometres north of Sydney, and it's where the Hastings River comes out to meet the Tasman, and it's very important. It's always been very connected to Sydney for 2 reasons. Firstly, Lachlan Macquarie, one of the early governors, made a penal colony here for the very bad people, and he used to organise these great rural plans. He was very clear about what he wanted. So he said, we're going to put the convict barracks here, we're going to put the government officials here, we're going to put the two churches here, Catholic and Anglican, on the top of the hill, and the people that need to mitigate or go between this lot and this lot, they'll live here on that middle diagonal line. And we had worked out through our kind of process of looking that our building sat on that pathway, and it was kind of about here. And we knew that there were cottages dating from 1811, so very early on in the establishment of New South Wales. We didn't know where they were, but we made this plan and we started to talk to the council, who again were a visionary council, that we thought there was something interesting under the ground. Our brief was for a 600-seat variable theatre, a studio and a regional art gallery, and we wrapped it all in public space. And then we guesstimated that the remnants, if they were there and if they existed, would be about 1.5 metres under the ground, because we knew that the street, Clarence Street, when it was redirected slightly, it was lifted up. We knew if we lifted the floor up, we could kind of make this vertical interstitial space in this location here. And so we did find some remnants. They were very precious. There were also little bits and pieces of pottery and crockery found as well. So these were recorded by the archaeologist. And the foyer came down here, and then we located the loos and things back here, so as you came down to the loos, you could get a sense of this view. So this is now obviously on the outside. There's a forecourt that we kind of made. Here it's a kind of a glass shell, hence its name, with a timber container on the inside. This, as you come along the side of this timber container, you're invited down the stairs to see the ruins on the right. All of the things that we collected we put into this showcase to kind of make a physical connection to Port Macquarie's history. And Port Macquarie is not a town that has much history. When you walk around, you can't really find a connection to its history, but this deliberately kind of modern intervention of a building actually has made a connection to its history. The other connection we were trying to re-establish for this region, Port Macquarie, was at a cultural level, because all of the timber for the Opera House came from the Hastings, which is the region around Port Macquarie. And we had this fab idea that we would get the timber out of the Opera House, we would bring it home to Port Macquarie and build our building out of it, because it looked like the two projects would be running simultaneously. That didn't happen, so then we spent a lot of time with local timber people learning about the local timbers that we could find to make the interior of this building deliberately out of timber, and creating as many connections as we could to the local community. And I'd just now like to touch on three larger projects. They're kind of urban design projects. And there's something, I think there's a very interesting change of the winds going on at the moment at a kind of an urban and a planning level in our working world, certainly. And that's that the historic kind of metric-based planning controls of height, floor space, bulk, all of those sorts of things, we're now beginning to realise that they're actually totally useless, and all they do is make lousy buildings. So a lot of planning controls, a lot of entities are trying to rethink how we might go about making large-scale buildings for the future. And these are three. I just picked three because they're very different in their approach. So on the left here, this is Sydney Olympic Park Town Centre, which is where the Olympics are, and there is a incredibly prescriptive, archaic podium and tower planning control that our client asked us to challenge deliberately. These I'm just mentioning this because these are labels around the wrong way. So this is Sydney Olympic Park. This one is actually not Sydney Olympic Park. It's 120 Collins Street, Melbourne. It's amazing it always takes to put into public before you can see the mistake, but sorry about that. Melbourne has kind of led the way in terms of having urban design or urban argument-led planning proposals as opposed to numerical planning values. And then this third project is called Central Station, and it is a vast area in the centre of Sydney currently being redeveloped. So if we start with the Sydney Olympic Park Town Centre, we inherited this kind of plan where there's a grid, you can kind of see the streets underneath, and what this proposes is the next, this will be the second iteration after the Sydney Olympics, is, as I mentioned before, a series of block streets with podiums and towers. So our client, who owns a huge piece of land, collected 3 architects together and said, we would like a counter proposal, an urban design argument. So we sort of latched on to the ground plane, I guess, having a kind of sort of a slightly strange fantasy in the complexities of public domain. But the idea here, you can kind of see it, is to have an elevated landscape that runs up through this entire site that then binds all of the different buildings together. And we can kind of see here in section that there's, and I think will be one of the last archaic acts of the region, a large car park underneath, even though we're right next to the train station, 2 floors of retail, and then we've made a proposal for a university to sit in here, or the arm of a university, sports club, and then the more conventional apartment and office buildings surrounding. So we created this sloping, elevated ground plane that then interconnected all these different towers at multiple levels. And then in the circle here, this is a little bit like the quadrangle of the university. So when we put all those uses together, we can kind of see that yellow is the university, where you can enter it in different ways on multiple levels, and then the landscape sitting on the top. So we've kind of, the objective here is to increase the ground plane, and this is one of the real challenges that we're faced with at the moment, is that if we are bringing vast numbers of people into areas, this project would have about 300,000 square metres of building, or about 30,000 people. Where do those people go? Where is the high quality public open space for them to just hang out and be in? And here, of course, is the mandatory sizzling perspective that you have to do to capture the bureaucrats' eyes. So this was used as a tool to challenge the established planning technique. So it's called it has a technical term. It's called an unsolicited bid. So there is now a pathway within Sydney, New South Wales in particular, that you can go to government and say, actually, we know all the work you've done, it's terrific, but we actually have another idea, and these are the merits. And whilst these projects have had relatively low success rate, some of them are now starting to happen. This is 120 Collins Street, which is at what's referred to as the Paris end of Collins Street in Melbourne. And this was our site here. This grey piece here had been one of the first of the Melbourne super towers built in the 80s, designed by Darryl Jackson. There had been a spectacular 1860s church designed by Joseph Reed, some beautiful little remnant buildings, and it was a competition, and we just did what we thought was the most obvious thing to do in Melbourne, and that is to put a laneway from Collins Street to Little Collins Street, and we thought, well, everybody will do that, and that's not going to get us anywhere. So it turned out that we were successful in this competition because we were the only architect from outside of Melbourne, but we're also the only architect that made this physical connection of the laneway, which is really just, you can kind of see it in this diagram, it's very restorative, it's just reconnecting probably something that was always there. And this is the kind of the diagram or the argument that says, if we make this laneway, we can then put a proper building on the corner, because what the 80s building had done in true 80s style was erode the corner. And with this strong church on the corner, we thought, well, okay, let's make our own symbolic corner. and we worked with this idea of an undulating foil. We made the new building of a similar proportion of the Joseph Reed Church. This church actually has a very strong line through here, so we didn't want to overwhelm the church and then create a really fantastic connecting space in between. It gave us a ground plane, something like this. This is the original 80s tower and the church at this point with a laneway, and a new connection in off Russell Street, because in the 30 years since this building was designed, Russell Street has become a much more important street than it was 30 years ago. And then starting to look at how this might look with this kind of foil building with a landscape top, so our trees are our spires, and then that's the section coming from Russell Street up into the existing podium, and it gave us a kind of a relationship like this between the new glass foil building and the original church, and then undercutting the whole ground level to make a kind of a new retail connection. To justify this, we went through all sorts of mapping. We mapped all of the shops in the region, and we found which brand stores were missing, because these were commercial clients, and we thought that's what would get them in, but really they just loved the laneway. So it was kind of easy in a way. Now, unfortunately, this project I can't show you. I'm not allowed to show you, but it's kind of interesting. It sits at the southern end of Sydney. It's Central Station. It's a vast piece of land. It's several hectares. And of course, everything that happens in Sydney is kind of connected to this place, whether it be through transport or sewer, or all the different areas that press in upon this area. And what I did want to show you is the methodology to design the new building, which we effectively evolved. And it's come about through a number of different forces. So firstly, everybody's waking up to the fact that major government agencies that need to deliver particular infrastructure, such as a train system, that is their preoccupation. Trains are their preoccupation. So to actually rebuild or regenerate a portion of the city is not their area of expertise. So what happened here was that the government architect got involved, and they engaged an architectural practice, OMA, from Holland, to come up with what they called a vision and strategic framework. And then that in turn collapsed itself down to a series of aspirations. Those aspirations were then taken by us representing Transport for New South Wales. So we've deliberately got two sets of architects working for two government agencies. And then we took these somewhat global approaches that they have had great success in cities all around the world, and tried to bias them to make them appropriate for this context. And then we said, okay, let's break the project up into different ways of looking effectively. So we've got the vision and the strategic framework. We then have research and analysis, so that's fairly conventional, going out and finding out what are the issues. And of course there are hundreds of issues and they're really complicated. And there's a sort of a triangle that everything fits around, so that we have transport at the top of it. That means that the trains have to keep running, and the buses and the light rail. Some are underground and some are above ground and some are being built. It's very complicated. We have the public domain and we have the built form. So often in urban design we have two of those three things that we're working with: public domain and built form. But here we have this notion of kind of transport, which sort of makes it really interesting. So we then said, okay, well, let's have within this notion of urban design framework three particular ways of working. So one, we called them key strategies, which was what are the big ideas. Then we broke those down to public domain gestures. What are the things that the public really want to get out of this? So some of these were created in abstract or in isolation from the site. And then we with this third category that we called sub-precinct initiatives. And what we did was we took the site and we came up with 8 sub-precincts which surrounded the site. and different teams went in and analysed those areas, and they pulled ideas out of the sub-precinct to go into the major project. So we're working at big scale and little scale at the same time. Then we put that together in what we call schema options over here, and then scenario testing. So we picked particular areas that are important, and we designed them in different ways, and we've kind of tested them. Now, ideally, we had a partner practice on this project, Fender Katsalidis, and from Melbourne, and what we really should have done is picked out 4 more firms to come and take each of these key areas and do their own scenario testing, so it was outside of our team. We kind of haven't had that opportunity, but and then all of those ideas get collapsed back down to the aspirations. And the idea of this diagram is that you can pick an aspiration and you can follow its evolution through the project, and each of these will take you to a different part of the document that you can kind of explore. I just wanted to, I don't want to get too dry, but I thought this is such a kind of pressing issue that we're facing at the moment, and it's all kind of, I guess it's at the feet of too much, too quickly. But we have no other choice because our worlds, our urban environments are just growing so quickly. We need to try and devise methods of designing ways that create richness. And I think our work was mirrored by a report put together by a guy called Michael Harris at the Urban Built Environment at the University of New South Wales. And he analysed a whole lot of kind of global mixed-use mega projects like this. And he identified that there were 5 common criticisms across every project. And he sort of, and I kind of paraphrased his findings, but I think it's really interesting. So the first thing was introverted modes of governance that circumvent planning policies and principles, so that trying to pull it out. So all of that complexity around the edge, trying to take that out of the equation, when in fact it's the complexity around the edge that creates the project. Then there's this notion of the kind of global economic positioning towards a kind of global elite, i.e. where the money comes from is going to have a major bearing on how the project ends up. And this is something that Raoul Marotra refers to as frictionless capital, which I think is a really interesting term. And then there's this notion of the physical and social disconnection from the host city. And then the propensity towards global form making, and by global form making I mean sort of a generic architecture that we can find everywhere in the world, which again is kind of disconnected from the host city. And then often a sort of inevitable kind of minimum commitment to the public domain, when of course that needs to be turned around the other way, because the public domain is the most important component of the whole thing. I'd like to talk about our ESD strategy because it's really interesting. It's all about measuring the temperature of the ground. Central Station is the hottest part of Sydney because it's got hectares of ballast, black ballast, which just heats up, and that re-radiates and heats up that portion of the city. I'm not allowed to talk about that, so I won't. But what I will say is that the project director, who's quite a character, was getting excited about our sustainability and resilience strategy, and he was banging the table, and he said, "We're going to do a brilliant job of this. We're not going to do an Australian cricket team number." So just to change scale for a moment, we're going to go and look at a restaurant, the Bennelong restaurant, which sits inside the Sydney Opera House. It's in the 2 small shells to the south. It's one of, I think, Utzon's great spaces. I think it's one of the great spaces of the world, but I just love this plan because it is so beautifully simple. And I kind of look at some of our plans and go, man, why can't we just draw like this? Our response, so our bridge here in this project, is trying to find a form of interpretive design. We can't replicate Utzon. We don't know what Utzon was thinking. Everybody in Sydney will tell you what Utzon was thinking, but it's kind of all conjecture anyway. But our strategy here was to say, we're going to make the elements, the new elements of the restaurant, part of the ground plane, so the podium. So the Opera House is the podium and the shells, and we thought, well, this new work will just sit with the podium, and then the shells can float free. This is the kind of simple section through the restaurant, and it was on 3 levels. So our approach here was to have 3 restaurants inside of this one big restaurant. So on each level there was a different restaurant, and the restaurateur loved this idea, and they have essentially have different food. There's fine dining at the bottom because it's close to the kitchen. There's a bar in the middle because that's where there's the least amount of room. And at the top there's seating and drinking area with food served from the bar here. So, you know, we may think our lives are controlled by our stomachs, but here it's nice to know that the architecture is controlling our eating habits. So here this is the view at the top with the first of our new forms at this point. This is in the centre, looking over the bar, which is a giant brass object. And one of the interesting things about the Opera House is that all the finishing metal was bronze, and the stainless steel as we know it today didn't exist in the mid-50s, in the late 50s when Utzon was designing this building, and bronze was his metal of choice. And then we see the kind of lower level again defined by another one of these elements. And these elements are playing with I guess the chthonic masonry, heavy podium nature of the Opera House, but once you get up close to them, they're not concrete, they're felt. So they're kind of soft and squidgy, and of course there are these giant acoustic absorbers in the space. It's a restaurant, so we've got to do all the restaurant shots. Of course you get a table. This table was very controversial because it didn't have a tablecloth, and I had joy of having dinner one night with a sort of a what I'd call Sydney Great Dane, and she was horrified there were no tablecloth, and she said dining at a table without a tablecloth is like sleeping in a bed without sheets. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but of course we're just trying to play with the idea of the tablecloth in this little corner. The space itself originally had some amazing lights designed by Peter Hall, and Peter Hall designed a lot of the interiors for the Opera House, early on in discussion and consultation with Utzon, but later on without Utzon. And he had these lights called fountain lights, which were tubes that came up and folded over. They had long since gone when we worked on this tenancy, so we kind of reinvented them in this deliberately kind of destable form, and these quite beautiful melted lamps designed by Tom Dixon. For our sins, we've kind of moved on from there, and we're now working on most of the public spaces in the Opera House using this method of interpretive design, but everything we do has to be reviewed by a panel called the Eminent Architects Panels, and as you may guess, there's a lot of architects on the panel. So getting consensus is really interesting. So we have all these endless kind of arguments around intent, but it's really interesting to have this kind of cultural object which is really it's embedded or buried in the time of its invention, yet this contemporary city is moving on, and this contemporary city is trying to work out how to live in this building. It's kind of really, it's a really fascinating process. This is a railway station upgrade. It's kind of in the southern part of Sydney, and we kind of know that because all of these sandy forms, they're kind of soft and curvy, whereas of course at the northern end they're pointy and rocky. And this station was originally set up to service these pleasure gardens which went down to the river or the bottom bay of Sydney. The Transport have embarked upon a huge program of bringing accessibility to train stations, which sounds simple, but on a station like this, it's hugely complicated because it's not one context, it's 3 very different contexts. So we have a series of significant gardens which have high heritage significance. We have a platform, and we have this kind of level change. So that when we're looking at one station, it's actually a whole lot of different conditions to think about. So finally, we kind of see through the miasma of this metaphor of bridges and actually find a real one, which is kind of nice. But so this is the proposal that there's a sinuous curving steel bridge with three masonry objects all doing different things. So this is a kind of a landscape cutting. This is long and skinny in the platform, and this is connecting into the street. But we did this through using a mechanism and a document. There's a very interesting document that's produced by the New South Wales Heritage Office and the Institute of Architects called Designing in Context. And it pulls out a series of words, and I don't know if you can see them, but significance, character, siting, scale, form, materials, and colour. And where this document is totally brilliant is not so much in giving us some top tips on how to design things. It's more about in the engagement with the multiple stakeholders, because we know that when we talk to the guys at Transport for New South Wales, Sydney Trains, they only want to use three materials: concrete, concrete, and concrete. And so we kind of want, obviously, coming from a public domain or urban design point of view, we want something a little more richer, a little more engaging. So suddenly these categories give us give us a way to kind of work with these people. So here we see the kind of plan. This is the street, the significant gardens, the curving bridge, and then this is more of a landscape setting, but with this very steep level change. And so in doing so, we collected an image that was significant to the history and therefore the context of the station, which was, and here we can see on the left the Oatley pleasure grounds, and talking about the continuation of the landscape tradition on the side. The original station was made out of timber, this incredibly beautiful little timber structure, and then we've used our concrete, so we get a tick for concrete, but we get a cross for the fact that we've ribbed it because we want to bring texture to it. But we can do that because we can pin it back to this key document. And then the notion of the bridge actually being steel. This is the next bridge down the line. It's in steel, and we wanted our bridge to be steel. And that coming back to this notion of the landscape setting, there are incredibly beautiful trees in this area, and that we wanted to bring a level of detail to this project so that it would be give us a sense of the subtlety and the poetry of trees. And so you can kind of see the sort of nature of the concrete, and then the walkway that runs across the inside of the bridge is deliberately kind of white, it's light, it's elegant, and it's kind of connecting back to that kind of notion of the dappled light of trees. And within infrastructure projects, this is a very difficult thing to achieve, but this document was key in allowing us to deliver it. And it was quite funny because the minister, because this is a small suburban station and probably wasn't well enough surveyed by the burghers of Transport New South Wales, it never really got an opening. And the minister saw this photo about 6 months after it had been in use, and he said, "I'm going down there to open it." So he had his photo taken pretty much in the middle of here. There was a ribbon, and he was standing there and opening it. And I think that's a real triumph that we actually can bring some of these qualities that are really important to us as architects. Actually, if we can get there, other people can see the resonance of them. So again, in the kind of southern end of the CBD, we do spend a lot of our time down the south end of the city. It's kind of the grungy end of town. And this is a project called Kensington Street Precinct, and it is off the side of a very large commercial development, which was the Carlton United Brewery, which was sold. A master plan was prepared, and then it was redeveloped as a mixed-use development. We ended up with Kensington Street, which is this piece here, and it was a collection of a whole lot of different buildings, some very small terraces, some pubs, and we set about creating a series of principles to sort of bridge this gap between what was and what we thought could be. So the first thing is this notion of extending the ground plane. We're bringing all these people here, where do they go? And so one of the gestures is to shorten the backs of these terrace houses, to bring people through here and to sleeve it with new space at the rear. And this now has a name called Spice Alley, and you can kind of wander through here, and it's a whole series of food courts with different distinctive courtyards. It allowed us to do another very important thing, was because all of these buildings were heritage terrace houses, we wanted to keep the ground plane lower so that the terrace houses came up out of the street, because that's how a terrace house kind of gets its sort of streetscape or its urban dignity in a way. So by sloping and undulating the plan, we could get level access for equity across the back. We started to think about this notion of scale transition. We knew we had 20 to 30 story buildings here. We didn't know what they were, but we knew they would go here, and we had 1 and 2 story terraces here. So we wanted something that could bridge that transition. And then it's not often you get to work on a kind of a whole street. I don't think the developer quite knew what they were doing, giving us the whole project, but anyway, it happened, and we just pretended it was this small, funny little thing off the side. So we started to think a lot about how we would work at a level of urban composition and stitching all these elements together. We knew we had to pull down a whole lot of buildings, and we spent a lot of time designing buildings, but is there a method we could bring to the unbuilding of the project to bring a kind of a design approach to unbuilding? And then, obviously maximising streetscape activation wherever we could. And just before we get to the photos, one of the things we found was through here. This had been built over, but we found that there had been a historic laneway through here. And then the notion of urban authenticity, and we chose these words deliberately. We deliberately didn't want to use the word heritage, because heritage is becoming a kind of a debased term. And urban authenticity tries to hint at something broader than heritage. It's tapping into the real things of our city. What are the real things of our city? So they may not be solely fabric, they might be events that had happened there over a long period, and how would we bring those back? So this image is looking at the entrance to the hotel, the Clear Hotel, which sits on Kensington Street. We have Kensington Street here, and this was the opening up of the laneway, which was a key gesture in extending our ground plane. This is the backside of the hotel with its new crown on the historic building. And then looking at the streetscape, that with great difficulty we took the original floor slab, which was up here, and we dropped it down to the street. And then we spent a lot of effort in getting a really beautiful surface on the street. We wanted it to be a pedestrian precinct. It ended up being a shared zone, primarily pedestrian, but with northbound vehicles mainly for emergency vehicles and service vehicles. So we get a sense now we're looking down the street, looking across the street, and into one of a series of new little buildings which punctuate all these wonderful old grungy walls. When we were showing the Institute of Architects around last year, they got quite antsy because this piece of grass is actually fake. It's AstroTurf, and I was shocked to see that the architecture school has gone the same way, which is obviously means they've got lots of students, which is great. And one of them coined the phrase that this was authentic AstroTurf. And then this is looking at the northern end of one of the terraces. So where the back of the terrace is here, we're moving north and we're hooking around, and we get a slightly better view here of this idea of unbuilding. We literally just sliced off the rear of the terraces and put these glass plates on them, a little bit like a science experiment. You can see another one kind of here, so that the insides of these quite exquisite terraces are just kind of seen to the street. New little buildings that are kind of nestled in and climb up, and you can see here how the parapet, the original brick parapet, has been thought about with the glass coming over the face, so we could keep that parapet. And in this technique, we avoided all of the kind of nasty flashings that we knew we couldn't control. And then looking at the street with the scale of just the absolute tiny scale of these terrace houses, and then its partner building on the other side, which is student housing, a collection of minuscule little rooms, but putting a screen on this building so that it can be read, both collected together to make a giant scale to talk to these very big buildings, which are kind of up here, and yet have enough detail in here to talk to the small terraces. And you can kind of see that the geometry, all of this comes out of the roof forms of the terraces. So the old Greer Hotel sits at the northern end of that street. And the kind of logic behind this building was to have a new piece at the top, but the scale of that piece would come out of the rather square window in the Deco Greer Hotel, the more perpendicular or vertical Victorian window, and we just made this curtain wall screen up out of these two shapes. And in doing so, we brought a new top to the building, but the scale is maintained and is consistent with the original building. We were really keen to get fabulous restaurants on the side here opening out onto the street, and the hotelier for the Greer Hotel, Peng Leclo, had this absolute obsession with restaurants, and he found the most wonderful restaurateurs to do all of this. And then he was even totally fascinated by an idea that we thought would be shot down on day one, but the idea that the public could just wander through the middle of the hotel. So the actual reception of the hotel is here, the bar is here, and this is effectively a thoroughfare. We put the rooms in the administration building because they lended themselves to that more comfortably, and the reception uses in this strangely trapezoidal deco building. This room here is very large because that was the original boardroom for the Carlton United Brewery. So all big decisions in relationship to beer were made there. Therefore, the entire nation followed this room. And it was kind of really fascinating because it had a loo, which is here. The loo was an all-gents loo. And we thought that was such a fascinating kind of cultural observation for us now. We've kept it. So the people who come and stay in this room, they get the original ante-room for the boardroom. They get the boardroom with a new furniture, etc. inside of it, which is organised like petitions. And then they get this period piece lavatory, which is pretty basic. And then they get this incredibly beautiful and luxurious bathroom. So this is the kind of ante-room to the main bathroom. This is the laneway between the two buildings, our kind of unbuilding, a little bit kind of obsessive, but we sort of went through this and then deliberately using mirror form. So here we're standing on the ground looking up to the sky. These bridges are mirrored so that they appear to us to sort of plunge through this sliced line of the building. So we literally cut the building from top to bottom. And that cut was essential for the bringing in of the machinery and the new equipment such as lifts and things. So foyer bar. It had been a really grungy university hang, this bar. So we made the carpet like it had already been pre-stained by a whole lot of students, even though it's beautiful new carpet. It actually is a little bit lush when you're there. But again, it's playing this game of its previous use. This was one of the rooms. This was, believe it or not, a training bar room. This is where you went to learn how to pour beer. Evidently, it's very complicated. And so we had it at this bed head, and that you can kind of, I don't know, jump off the bed head and have some fun or something. But it kind of, it's just engaging with these remnants that we had. We had no real requirement to keep them, but we just thought they were kind of interesting. And here is the glamorous part of that bathroom in the boardroom, and here is the original bathroom complete with slop hopper, which is where you wash your mop out. One of the original staircases, the rooftop. And I'm almost there, but I just thought I'd just thought I'd talk about this house mainly because it is possibly conceptually inconsistent with the rest of the projects, but it's new. So I kind of, it's our shiny new project, so I quite like to talk about it. It sits at the top of what's called the Balmoral sand plain. This is a north-facing beach, or northeast. The heads, the Sydney Harbour, are out here. It's a beautiful sloping sand slope, and there's an escarpment that moves through here. And our clients had lived there for 20 years. They loved this site because they'd never watered their garden once, even though they had a beautiful garden, because all the water came down the escarpment. Yet it was surrounded by all these houses and had this very strange shape. And we soon learnt that they had quite an extraordinary art collection, and they wanted a comfortable house, they wanted a place to put their art collection, and they wanted to keep their garden that they had nurtured for the last 20 years. So we devised this strategy whereby we set up a spine, and the spine kind of worked from sort of art as artifice at one end, and landscape as nature at the other end, and we literally distributed the house along this spine. Because these seem to be the two most important things of this couple's life that they were truly passionate about. We then distributed the living rooms in the part of the site that got most amount of sun. We then partnered up outdoor spaces with those rooms, put some service spaces on the kind of the backside of the spine, if you like, and then replicated that again upstairs using these forms that press into the landscape. And then the forms themselves we eroded so that the forms, so the planes that were maintained attracted artworks, and those that are eroded invited the landscape into the house. And then we covered this house with this undulating concrete roof, and as we see, the kind of plan becomes slightly more formalised, each living room getting a dedicated outdoor space, with a kind of a little courtyard in here that is having a sculpture placed in it, and then upstairs with this void at the centre of the house to make a kind of centre of the dwelling, and then the formalisation of the concrete roof, and that it changes its shape as it goes along in reference to the spaces that sit underneath. It formalises itself to the street, and then it just opens up to the south into this kind of garden. So we made a house that looked a little bit about like this. We're looking at the family room at this point from the garden. This is the front door looking along the spine. And I do have to apologise for the photos I have because they are quite strange. There's, I didn't know this before I did this house, but some artworks, there's all sorts of kind of politics around them, and photographic credits get difficult, which means we can't give you a proper I can't give you a proper photo essay of the house, so you have to make up some missing bits. But we're at the front door here. There's a significant artwork behind us. There's the tree in the distance, and we kind of see that we can't see it here, but the concrete's been eroded above to bring the north light in over the corridor, and then the roof is formalised up to meet the street. This is looking down towards the tree at the end of the spine. This is one of the outdoor spaces connecting the family room to the kitchen, and we kind of see here that it's treated just like a room, but it doesn't have a roof. And then we've brought in these kind of eroding planes that we started to call them, which were mirrors, and you can kind of see that they're sort of everywhere when you start looking. This is the kitchen, and we're kind of balancing this idea of the kind of natural landscape here and the artifice of art here. So there's always this kind of double reading of nature and artifice. So upstairs, this is how the kind of roof or the ceiling organises itself over the dining room. The balustrade and all of the upstairs walls are treated as joinery, so that we just get a sense of this flowing roof form, deliberately made out of very thin strips of roughly sawn Oregon. And as you go through this wall, we go into a beautiful pavilion, but it has a collection of Albert Tucker paintings, and we couldn't photograph that. So now we start to see here the the joinery forming these walls around the kind of study. And then this is looking from one study to the other. This is the kind of her study. This is the his study, and really they semaphore across the void when they want tea and different things. But we can kind of see how the roof formalises itself up along this edge where it meets the edge, and then we're opening up to the south at that point. This is just a couple of photos of the forming of this roof. We were standing here with a client, and he said, "Oh, well, when you did that sketch, I had no idea you were talking about 17 blokes pouring and pumping concrete like crazy." But it wasn't all bad, because it turned out that this house has exceedingly good environmental credentials, because tragically one of these men dropped his Prius car keys in a concrete mix, and they are still there today. This is looking at the front of the house. We're coming towards the front of the house, and we can see how the drape of the concrete ceiling is deliberately propped at the top as opposed to the bottom to accentuate the plasticity of the roof and its kind of drape-like quality. We can see the bringing of the artworks into the architectural composition of the house, and then the pressing in of the landscape into the form of the house. And lastly, this is again back in the southern end of the city. We were invited to do a competition for a new university building on an old school site. So this is a boys' on a girls' school dating from 1883. It's called Blackfriars Public School, and we've been asked to put a university building here for the University of Technology of Sydney. So what was the bridge? What could we find to make a connection between those different types of educational institutions, the different times, and the kind of different aesthetic sensibilities that we have today? So our first design gesture was to think about the curtilage of heritage buildings, and that's one of the things I find really fascinating about old buildings. It's not so much the building themselves, of course, that's the gorgeous object, but the actual spaces around them and how the different sensibility that we can see in that curtilage. And it's really fascinating to look at an urban artefact, go through the built properties of that building to find the philosophy that created it, and to think about that philosophy. So our first move actually was to put this piece of public space in here, defined by a tree at the street, which is existing, or should be. Unfortunately, we're going to have to replace it. But and then a collection of smaller trees at the back. And then, having set up this space, we said, well, it's really important that we look after this space. So we shaped our new building so that it had a kind of profile that matched that neo-Gothic school building. And then we started to think about how our building would meet the street. Our side is much longer out here, just as this side is here, but they put all this effort into turning the building and making a bay that addressed the street quite formally, and we thought, okay, well, we can do that too. And then we've got these kind of sentinels from different periods, but sort of talking together in a way. And then sitting inside this gable is this really beautiful bay. So we subdivided our front into 3 bays. And then when you look closely at this building, there's this, what you think is an angular neo-Gothic building. There's all this beautiful curving timber that we brought into our junction planes at this point. So that kind of, so we pulled out the geometry all the way through here, and there's a beautiful little daycare centre that's just been built originally designed by Lacoste Stevenson. These are the original buildings, so we pulled out this geometry and started to build our new glass screen or our curtain wall out of this geometry, using the Gothic, neo-Gothic isosceles triangle as a way of generating our architecture. And then we see the bay here in elevation, the school, and then our building meeting the street in a similar way. And in doing so, bringing the prominence and importance into this public open space here. And it's very interesting, this university, the University of Technology of Sydney, has very little open space because it's the kind of total urban university. And so when we look at the roof plan, we get a sense of our glass, the the slate roofs and space in between. And the section, which, I mean, to be honest, you can just start to see how the facade is working, and then the stair, the kind of deliberately extroverted stair as a vertical connector through the middle of the university, and then organising the ground plane so that there'll be different types of uses on each floor. It's a little bit like a speculative office building, but what we've suggested is that the reflective space or the research space is at the ends, and the collaboration space is along here, and all the communication spaces are through here. So we can have a building organisation that sort of reflects our urban aspirations for the building. And it's really interesting because the competition went from outside in, and now we're working with the university. We're working from inside out, which has been a really fun process. And one of the things we suggested to the university, which is not drawn in this drawing, but we proposed it as, I guess, a repositioning of the university. So it's the University of Technology of Sydney, and you know, a lot of fabulous CLT or cross-laminate timber construction is coming into the Australian market, a lot of it coming from New Zealand. And we actually worked with XLAM, a New Zealand company, to develop a system for this timber floor, and we proposed it as an alternate, and the university loved the idea. They were prepared to pay the cost premium for it, so we're now developing up a timber structure, which is really rather exciting for us. And then this is how the shaped curtain wall of the facade works. Series of laminated timber structure, effectively a glass plane, and then a series of sunscreens, which kind of makes this snake skin, and the snake skin is doing different things on different places. So where we need the sun screening, we have them. In some places it's very thick, and in other places it's quite thin. And that gave us a building that looked something like that. And you'll be pleased to know that that's about as many projects as I'm going to inflict upon you. But I just wanted to conclude and just return to this kind of theme, mining the continuum, architecture without beginning or end. And as we all work away evolving our towns and cities, it never ceases to amaze me how well buildings that engage with this notion of the continuum are perceived by the broader community, as opposed to buildings that have just landed from outer space. And I think it has something to do with the retention of the site's perceived consciousness and memory, even though kind of a shiny new partner has arrived. And so then architecture can then magically transcend or bridge time as more than one generation is represented at once in our evolving environments, which is of course why we must represent our own generation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've probably got time for just perhaps one or two questions. I'll throw one in to start with if I can, which is all these some very large projects and some projects which engage with very, very kind of complex contexts. So you're kind of drifting into the territory of Rem Koolhaas, of bigness, and a single person not being able to understand all of it. So how do you organise your office when you've got such kind of large, complex projects to?
Well, chaotically, really. We try. I mean, we practice in our office what we call. We're about sort of 40 odd architects, and we practice what we call a kind of organic architectural evolution, where everybody's encouraged to kind of find their own path or their own interest, because we want people being really passionate about the different parts of architecture that they look at. So I think it's this issue of inquiry which comes back to looking, and we spend a lot of time looking, and there are a lot of other really good lookers out there. I don't mean aesthetically, but In the heritage world, there are heritage architects and consultants who write master plans or do heritage impact statements or those sorts of things. So we use a lot of those people's research. So I guess research is the key to the answer in a way that we're always trying to research and using. Our architects spend a lot of time kind of researching and bringing that information back. But I have to say the scale thing is something we're really struggling with. It's relatively new. It's probably 2 to 3 years old in our practice. But since we did that project, it was the Sydney Olympic Park Town Centre, where the client said they employed us because we were the only architects who turned up and didn't talk about net to gross and efficiencies and all of that sort of stuff. We talked about urban issues and cultural issues. And so I think there's this really interesting thing that's going on in our world, which is something around authenticity and heritage. It's around cultural uses in the ground plane and the importance of the public domain and architecture. It's not, we're no longer working in the world where we're actually designing buildings. In some ways, the building is the last thing we kind of do. So it's really trying to get to the essence. And often there are multiple essences in a site. And I guess one of our strategies would be not to preclude one essence over another. Because it's all value judgment. We go, well, we don't like blue ones, but somebody else might come along and say, well, the blue ones are fantastic. So it's trying to keep as many of those things in play. And I think we're probably becoming a bit aesthetically remote from architecture, if that makes sense. We're not, we're never kind of campaigning for a particular aesthetic. We're kind of looking where the aesthetic comes from. What's the reason and what's the purpose of that aesthetic there? I don't know, that's such a big question. It's I don't think I answered it very well because I don't think we have the answer.
Right. Yeah, any other questions?
I'm interested to know about the kind of mechanics in some way of the way the Government Architects Office works with the types of pilot projects that you might be engaged in, but also whether with projects like the Central Railway Station, I mean, to work, all those sort of those infrastructure projects, are they having an overview or a kind of working, is there any kind of, how does it
so how does it work? It's really interesting. It's because there's some really wonderful people inside of the Government Architect's Office. So the Government Architect is a guy called Peter Poulet, and his kind of strategic henchman is a guy called Ben Hewitt, and if you saw him, you know why I use that word. He's enormous. And he's just, what he's done, they've got, the Government Architect has always had access to every government agency. So they use that as a mean to open the door to get in and say, we hear you're going to redevelop this piece of Sydney, let's say, you're trained guys. We want to bring in another way of looking, and they might set up the methodology. For us on Central, it was really weird when we started because we had no idea that was going on. We were engaged by Transport. And then when we realised what was happening, we said, okay, we've got to totally rethink. So we wrote a methodology for Central Station to get that project. We pretty much threw it out the door on the first day because we realised the Government Architect had done all this amazing work. So they'll work in a couple of different ways. They will then bring in, so the government agency sets the strategy. It makes the engagement, it sets the strategy, and then they will often bring in their own team who will bring or establish their aspirations. So they become broad aspirations. And then the utility, because the utility has a whole lot of serious concerns. I mean, obviously trains have to run and they have to be safe and they have big things and they're incredibly expensive. But what I think has happened in the past is the train guys have got so focused on keeping the trains on the tracks that they'd forgotten about all the urban issues. So it's really trying to address it from the city's point of view. So there's a kind of city stakeholder, and then there's a utility stakeholder. On Central Station, it gets even more complicated because there's a third stakeholder, which is the City of Sydney, which is an incredibly organised and incredibly powerful organisation that totally surrounds that site. So the station itself is not looked after by the City of Sydney, the state, but everything around it. So what we've then been doing is engaging. And one of the great things the government architect can help with is that people in transport say, well, we don't want you engaging with other stakeholders at this point because we don't know what we're doing yet. And whereas the government architect says, no, keep it open, just engage with everybody to make all these connections. So they're effectively just connecting everything in. And then there is the other thing that they've done is that all these major projects have a kind of a board, a little bit like the Opera House with the eminent architects panel. The Central Station has another board, which is a design and sustainability review panel, and that panel has a representative from a whole series of different agencies. And in fact, this project here for UTS, because it was such a contentious site, they had a design excellence competition solely for the purpose of getting a key stakeholder from the 4 organisations on the jury to pick the scheme so that they had a kind of a buy-in. So it's trying to kind of it's looking at it from multiple viewpoints, and it's something that you see in Europe a lot with universities, especially through urban landscape architecture schools. They will often get funding. You see it in Germany and Scandinavia, where they will get funding to actually run a parallel scheme for a major piece of a land or infrastructure, where the students are all working away, coming up with their proposal under the expert direction of brilliant theoreticians, and then there's the kind of professional practice doing their scheme, and those are often brought together and kind of looked at as if we're looking at it from different viewpoints. But the reality is our cities are just so complicated now, and every year we just get more and more people, we get less and less space, we need to improve the quality of the space. And one of the things I didn't show you because I'm not allowed, but that triangle I talked about with transport, public domain and building, we then put another circle around it, which has not been approved by Cabinet yet, called social equity. And that was representing what are all of the other things that come into this precinct. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think if you've got some more questions, you might want to grab Tim after the lecture. But it's just remains for me to say thank you again to JIB for their ongoing support of the lecture series. Come next week and see Uwe Rieger and his team presenting his augmented reality and virtual reality work. And thank you again for coming. And let us all just one last round of applause for Tim.